In 1947, the British government decided to split India, their biggest colony, into two countries, one with a Hindu majority and the other with a Muslim majority. They made this decision because they couldn't afford to keep controlling India and wanted to step away quickly. But this choice turned out to be a disaster. It caused one of the largest mass migrations in history and led to shocking levels of violence and destruction. Even today, the effects of the partition are still felt, with India and Pakistan, the two countries created, fighting several wars over the years. Perhaps if the British had known how much pain and conflict this would cause, they might have thought twice. Welcome to Unveiled History. The British made contact with India in the early 1600s and eventually assumed control over the country through the East India Company. However, in 1857, Indians rebelled against the company. The result was the end of the company's rule and the establishment of a new government known as the British Raj. But this did not stop Indians from desiring freedom from British rule. In fact, it had only made the independence movement grow, especially under Mahatma Gandhi, who was vehemently against the divide and rule policy employed by the British to rule India. This policy was used to maintain control over India for centuries. It involved keeping Indians divided so that they would be easy to control. To do this, the British created divisions among different religious groups, castes and ethnicities, and sometimes pitted them against each other. It was this division which had become deeply ingrained in the minds of Indians that made Muslim India create a separate political party, especially for Muslims, the All India Muslim League, in 1906. At the time, Hindus consisted of almost 70% of the population, while Muslims consisted of 25%. So, while a Hindu nationalist movement was growing, a Muslim movement was also growing under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who joined the party in 1913. Then came World War I, where more than 1 million Indian troops fought for the British. But after the war, the calls for independence grew even stronger, which led to mass protests in 1919. However, the British resisted, leading to the arrest of Gandhi. He was eventually released in 1924, but by that time, the relations between Hindus and Muslims had crashed. Over the next few decades, the relations continued to deteriorate as the independence movement grew and Britain continued to employ different divide and rule strategies. In 1939, Britain declared that India was at war with Germany, even though the Indian National Congress was not consulted. About 2.5 million Indians joined the Indian Army to fight for the British during World War II. In some ways, the British decision to drag India into the war was the final blow to British rule in India, as it had led to a full-scale independence movement across the country. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, had begun to call for a separate state for Muslims. After World War II, Britain had to deal with a severe economic crisis at home and civil unrest in India. The British realised that they could no longer afford the cost of running the empire, so it was agreed that India was granted independence, and a cabinet mission was dispatched to India in 1946. While the British were trying to set up an agreement with the different political parties and religious groups, Indian Muslims began to fear that they would be excluded from political rights within a united India. So, the leader of the Muslim League, Ali Jinnah, planned protests across the country calling for a separate nation state for Indian Muslims. The protests culminated in what was called Direct Action Day, which took place on August 16, 1946. However, the event sparked violence, leading to the death of thousands of people, an event now known as the Calcutta Killings. The Muslim leader, Ali Jinnah, had called for a peaceful demonstration, and in most of the provinces, the protests were calm and peaceful. However, in Bengal, specifically Calcutta, the events took a violent turn. The events leading to the violence are not exactly clear, but it has been generally agreed that the Muslim League's chief minister, Suhrawardy's speech during the rally may have been an open invitation to disorder. According to some reports, he is reported to have said that he had seen to police and military arrangements who would not interfere. Whatever he meant by that, the result was that the Muslim protesters started attacking Hindus and looting their shops immediately after the rally, with inflammatory anti-Hindu slogans on their lips. Soon after, shops, restaurants and cinema halls owned by Hindus were vandalised, looted and set on fire by Muslims. Hindu men and boys were brutally massacred, while girls were disrobed, abducted and raped. Many were taken as sex slaves. It was recorded that around 7,000 Hindus were missing on the first day of the riots. However, things further worsened when the Hindus decided to retaliate under the leadership of Gopal Chandra Mukhopadhyay. As the Hindus fought back, the number of casualties increased, especially on the Muslim side. The clashes between the two groups continued for a week until British forces were deployed into the city. However, by this time, about 4,000 people had died and over 100,000 had been left homeless. The events at Calcutta further cemented the notion of partition. In 1947, a new viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, arrived in Delhi with a mandate to find a speedy way of bringing the British Raj to an end. In early June, Mountbatten stunned everyone by announcing August 15, 1947 as the date for the transfer of power, which was 10 months earlier than expected. The reason for this decision is still up to debate, but this decision exacerbated the chaos that would come. Lord Louis also announced that it would be partitioned into a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan, but he did not explain where the boundaries would be. The following month, the British chose Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never travelled to India, to divide India on a map based on religious lines, leading to what is now called the Radcliffe Line. If something could define colonial stupidity and short-sightedness, then it is the Radcliffe Line. Radcliffe was given just 5 weeks to draw the boundaries that would affect the lives of millions of people for generations. He didn't know about Bengal and Punjab, which had an equal number of Hindus and Muslims. Simply put, he was a wrong man for the job. Radcliffe divided India into 3 parts, including India, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan. This meant that the culturally close areas of Punjab and Bengal were also split. Some years later, Radcliffe confirmed how wrong the decision was when he revealed that he had almost given Lahore to India. Anyway, the British didn't think much of their decision and published the boundaries made by Radcliffe on August 17, 1947. 2 days later, India and Pakistan declared independence, and the British Army departed India, leaving the two new countries in turmoil. Following independence and the partition, mass migration on a scale never seen before began in India. Millions of people moved to what they hoped would be safer territory, with Muslims trekking from India to West and East Pakistan, while millions of Hindus and Sikhs headed in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of them did not make it. As many as 14 to 16 million people may have been eventually displaced, travelling on foot, in bullock carts, and by train. Prior to the partition, the population of India was about 390 million, but after the partition, there were perhaps 330 million people in India, 30 million in West Pakistan, and 30 million people in East Pakistan. The mass migration was accompanied by massive violence and slaughter on both sides, which the newly formed government was not prepared for. One of the most affected regions was Punjab. This is not surprising, because the partition of India split the region of Punjab between the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. The Hindus lived in the west, while the Muslims lived in the east. Total migration across Punjab during the partition is estimated at 12 million people, with around 6.5 million Muslims moving into West Punjab and 4.7 million Hindus and Sikhs moving into East Punjab. The movement was accompanied by intense massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abductions, and savage sexual violence. Some 75,000 women were raped, and many of them were disfigured or dismembered. It was a horrible period. Later reports revealed that gangs of killers set whole villages aflame, hacking to death men and children and the aged, while carrying off young women to be raped. Some British soldiers and journalists who had witnessed the Nazi death camps claimed that the partition's brutalities were worse. Pregnant women had their breasts cut off and babies hacked out of their bellies. Infants were found literally roasted on spits. By 1948, the Great Migration began to draw to a close, but by then, more than 15 million people had been uprooted, and between 1 and 2 million were dead. Many were killed by members of other communities and sometimes their own families, as well as by the contagious diseases that swept through refugee camps. While both states managed to deal with the consequences of the mass migration, the effect of the partition destroyed any form of healthy relationship between the two countries. Today, Indian Muslims are frequently suspected of harbouring loyalties towards Pakistan, while non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan are increasingly vulnerable thanks to the so-called Islamization of life. It's been more than 7 decades since the partition, but more than 1 billion people are still living in its shadows.